All right, vamos a empezar. All right, welcome everybody. This is a roundtable that we're doing about the children on the border. It's for the press, but it's also for a better understanding of what's going on the border. We've gathered experts from around the state, people notable around the country as well in terms of their knowledge and their sort of on the ground knowledge of what's happening with our children. I'm Bob Sanborn, I'm president and CEO of Children at Risk, a statewide advocacy group, also here representing the Texas Family Leadership Council. With us today, and they'll just give you a wave and we'll get back to them in a minute, Sister Norma Pimentel, who is with Catholic Charities in McAllen. She's been at the forefront of this. Sister, nice to see you. Also with us today, Jennifer Nagda. Jennifer is with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Jennifer, nice to see you. And Jennifer, the Young Center is out of the Valley, San Antonio, and Houston. Also with us today, Maria Castillo. She's the supervising attorney with the Children's Detained program with RAICES out of San Antonio. Also with us, Linda Rivas. She's the executive director of Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center, and Linda's out of El Paso. And then finally, Yael, who is the director of the Center for New American Children with Children at Risk. Welcome all of you, and thank you all for being here. We've been seeing the surge of children on the Texas border. For children, for advocates of children, for any caring adult who cares about the well-being of children, this is a predicament that really needs to be addressed, so we're here to do that. But more importantly, it needs to be addressed quickly. We have an estimated 15,000 unaccompanied children that have come across our border. And we say it's really time to put aside politics and really focus on children's issues. I've been coming down to the border to talk around these issues, about surges, various surges year after year since 2014. Sister Norma and I have seen each other a number of times over the years as we've seen these surges come across our border. In 2014, we saw 60,000 kids come across that year, unaccompanied children. So we do know that this happens. This is not a unique thing, but we've also seen it work well, and we've seen it work very poorly. A lot of people in the news are asking why these kids are coming now. Two things that are important to note. We see these surges, and a lot of times they're seasonal, depending upon what the weather is like in Central America. So we'll see the surge sort of decrease as the weather gets more heated, if you will. Historically, that's one of the things that happens. We've also seen possibly the surge because of the horrible hurricanes that we saw in Central America this year. Because of the climate there, we know that that's having an impact. We know that possibly it's this more humanitarian approach following the law as it was intended by the Biden administration could have an impact on what's going on right now. But we also know that no immigration options that are being developed in the Senate and the House is a big part of this. We have not looked at the big picture around immigration, and it's probably time we do that. The other thing that we can't ignore is that last year we saw lower numbers because of the pandemic. And so is some of this built up? People that were intending to come, are they coming now? So all of these could be reasons why we're seeing the surge now. We're worried about this surge and what's going on. But remember, these numbers are too high no matter what. And it's probably a little bit of all of this that's happening. So there's a lot of blame going around and really not enough actions on the solutions. So today we want to give you sort of a walkthrough around what's happening on the ground, but also I want to mention just quickly some of these solutions. One is we really need to take care of these children, excuse me, now. Almost every one of these children have made a perilous journey because they know that there is a potential guardian or most likely a family member in the United States. We want to make sure that we minimize the housing them in facilities and get them to these family members, these guardians, as quickly as possible. We need to take care of them. It's important that we also understand the cost of reuniting them with their family members, should they have them here in the United States, is significantly cheaper than housing them in these federal facilities. So if we're looking for saving money, getting them to their families is more important. If we're looking for minimizing trauma, getting them to their families is much more important. They've had this traumatic journey. We want to make sure that they get reunited as quickly as possible. And we as a nation, by and large, believe in the power of the family. let's use that national belief, that power, get them to their families. This is going to be much more important than institutionalizing them. I'll say one more thing about immigration reform in DC. We need to stop showboating and begin to fix a system that ignores the realities. Currently, there are no options for these children and for families that are fleeing violence and despair in trying to come to the United States. We need to create options and let them understand what those options are. We need a system that works. We need to have a humanitarian outlook. And maybe we need to look at the evidence and the facts around immigration. And that might be a good start for us as well. Finally, I just want to say, these are children. They're children. And we need to take care of them. They're not Republicans or Democrats, but they are children. And as we as a nation, we care about children. So these are children that are in need of options. They need their family. They need TLC. Let's do the right thing for these children and reunite them with their family and do this, expedite this post haste, because this is going to be very important for their success later in life, and for us as a nation to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So let's go, Sister Norma. I know that you've been working there. Give us a few words before, and I want to ask you a couple of questions. But Sister Norma is down at Catholic Charities in McAllen and has been at the forefront of these surges for the last decade. So, Sister, give us an idea of what's going on.
Thank you, Bob. You know, what you just said is exactly what needs to be addressed. The reality, you just spelled it out very clearly. And yes, they're children. And I remember 2014 when we got involved with this right away because of the same reason of what's happening right now. And the one thing that was very clear, that all the law enforcement and everybody needed to be very clear what you just said right now. They're children. Let us not forget that they're kids, you know, and most of them a lot of times are very small. So I think addressing the reasons why they come and why making sure they're safe is why we have this reality happening here at the border right now with so many kids, because we want to make sure they're safe, you know. And I think that that's a wonderful thing about the United States, that has always had in place the process to make sure how do you help the child be safe, because they're not with their parents. So there needs to be a process to guarantee that, to keep them from human trafficking, to keep them from those that are going to hurt them, not sending them back, that we saw so many of them being sent back last administration. And so I think that's a priority that needs to be our focus, and make sure we help the present administration in addressing that, because I think they're trying to do that precisely. Make sure that we do keep these kids safe. And then the other thing that you said that's very important is making sure that this process is fast, that we don't keep them under custody anybody's. The best place these kids need to be is with their parents, with their families. That's the end goal. And so, because that's how we can guarantee that their safety faster, and not let any group or any entity take advantage and make profit out of them. And so I think basically this is where we are right now. And more than a crisis, it's an opportunity for us to do something about making sure that we resolve this correctly. And I just applaud what you just said as you started.
Thank you, Sister. Let me ask you one or two questions, because I know you have to run and take care of a lot of families. You're in the facility right now, but before we started the roundtable, we talked a little bit about COVID, and other people may want to mention this, but COVID is playing a part in everyone's life. What's happening right now with families and children in regards to COVID testing as they come across the border right now, Sister?
Yes, you know, one of the very first things when we started to see the numbers rise and the families being released, and I said, are they tested for COVID? And the answer was no. So right away, this local city government and the county government, we got together and we established a response to make sure every single person gets tested for COVID before they enter into our center. Whether they go into a bus station or an airport, we wanted to guarantee that that was in place. And so we have continued to do that. And I always question, why isn't that this is not happening before they enter a detention facility? We need to make sure we can contain the virus and help all of us, you know. And so anyway, I think they're working on that, and let's hope that it does happen so that COVID cannot be a problem or out of control. You know, I think that needs to be in place. And today I'm meeting with DHS because they are actually moving in to take over what we started. And so.
And then the final question I wanted to ask you, Sister, is I know that last year, we were keeping, the United States was keeping everyone on the other side of the border. And I know you were going over to Matamoros and you were working with those children and with those families. What is the biggest difference that you see right now in the policy between what was happening last year and what's happening right now?
Oh, well, it's the big amazing change is the fact that we're making something wrong right, you know, and to have accompanied this many families in Mexico for 2 years in such devastating, horrible conditions, where so many people were reaching out to provide for them the basic things like water, food, a tent, and even in spite of all of that, they were still suffering because it was a terrible situation that we're in. Thank God this administration started out by correcting that and liberating them from that human suffering that they were forced to stay because they were waiting in Mexico for so long. And now they're in the United States. I think it's God's plan to liberate his people to make sure they're safe. And thank God that happened already. I applaud the administration's immediate effort to correct that. And so I think now we're moving forward with, right now I just came from Reynosa at 7 in the morning because we're getting the people to cross. MPPs from this point of entry in Hidalgo have already started. And so we're doing that already. I'm expecting the group to arrive here very soon. And it's amazing. It's good that these people that were kept for so long in Mexico are now continuing that asylum process here in the United States. And I'm very happy for that.
Very good. It's funny, sister, you mentioned this is God's will. You would know better than anyone, right? You're the sister, so you know these things. So thank you very much, Sister Norma Pimentel from McAllen.
Story that I want to share with you all.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
I confirm it's God's plan. You know, months before we started the process of entering into the United States, the MPP, you know, in Matamoros, a little girl in the camp told the mom, and the mom said to me, Madrecita, mi hija me contó, you know, she said that her little girl, not even 8 years old, said, Mom, don't worry. God already told me that we're going to the United States on March 1st, you know? This was months before we even knew that this was going to happen. Well, the day that they started to let people cross into the United States from the camp, what happened was that I told the officer at the bridge, you know, at CBP, can you put this family in the list? And he said, but just put it to the end of the list so that at the end, they're going to be able to come with me to McAllen. So he did that for me. So on that day, they were on the list to cross over to the United States. There were so many of them that the last group was left until the following day. And so they ended up not crossing on that day that we had scheduled for them to cross. So they were scheduled to cross then the following day. And guess what day that was? March 1st.
Oh, wow.
That is a clear sign that this is God's plan.
Wow.
And I agree with that.
Very good. Sister Norma Pimentel from Catholic Charities in McAllen. Thank you so much, sister. Thanks for all that you're doing. And thanks for being here for the roundtable. Is Jennifer Nagda, did she leave? Is she still around? Jennifer, your video is out. So there we go. Okay, I get it. So Jennifer Nagda is the policy director for the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights out in the Valley, San Antonio, and Houston. Jennifer, give us a few words on what you see going on and then a couple of questions.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. And thanks to all of you for allowing me to be here. Sorry for the technical difficulties there. So there's this prevailing narrative, Bob, that there's some kind of new crisis taking place at our borders. And I would disagree. The roots of this crisis really track back decades to immigration laws and policies that are very much rooted in criminalization rather than welcoming, to foreign policy that failed to address the root causes of migration in many of the countries from which migrants flee, not just in the Northern Triangle, but in the Caribbean, countries in Africa, countries in South America, and countries in Asia. But it most certainly tracks back to the last 4 years, as both you and Sister Norma have mentioned, in which thousands of families were separated and then deported, in which hundreds of thousands of migrants were forced into homelessness along the Mexico side of the US border, and where in just 9 months in 2020, nearly 50,000 children were sent because of claims that they presented some sort of unique public health threat than other travelers did. 16,000 of those were unaccompanied children, and 34,000 of them were children with their parents and families. So the children whose arrivals right now are being covered in the press are in large part those same children who were turned away or taken from their families so many times in recent years. And then there are also the very steady number of migrants who have fled these same countries and regions I mentioned in similar numbers every year for a number of years. From my perspective, the crisis is not their migration, it's how we respond. And with respect to unaccompanied children, our response has been dramatically different over the last 2 months since the Biden-Harris administration has finally taken over. We are seeing major changes in how federal agencies are moving to reunite those children with their families in the United States. So the temporary facilities that HHS is creating to receive these children are hardly ideal, but they're needed because of decades of bad policymaking that favored massive institutional congregate care settings over small placements, which we know are better for children. When the pandemic struck, the absurdity of these massive institutional facilities was made really clear to the public. Moving forward, this administration and new administrations will be forced to move to a model of caring for children in small, community-based facilities or an expanded network of foster placements. More importantly, after spending years denying that children could be released both safely and quickly, the federal government is finally doing so. Probably not quickly enough, but just this week, and really less than 3 weeks after the arrival of a new head at the federal agency, they launched a completely revamped process for expediting the reunification of children with parents. They're even considering a proposal that would prevent children from being separated from their adult relatives, their kin, at the border. Those changes would have been completely impossible during the last administration, and they were even gently pushed aside during prior administrations. So for the press who are listening today, I would make one recommendation, which is to strongly discourage the use of the word surge or influx. It's an incredibly dehumanizing term for the children and the families who are seeking safety at the border, and it just doesn't reflect the fact that these are families who have been seeking entry and have been denied their legal right to seek protection over the last 4 years. On the COVID point, Bob, I would point out that COVID positivity rates, as they were reported this weekend among arriving migrants in Texas, is at or lower than the prevailing rate among the public in Texas. And public health experts have been unambiguous since last March that migrants and asylum seekers do not present a greater risk of spreading the pandemic than other travelers, including business travelers who are crossing the border every day, spring break travelers who are in full season right now, and others. So labeling migrants as a public health risk, I think, is not just disingenuous, but it taps into the sort of criminal and racist narrative of the last 4 years. If I leave you with one message today, it's not that the Biden administration has somehow implemented policies that are creating a new crisis at the border. Rather, the administration is following the law as it applies to children, and it's doing so for thousands of children who were harmed by the prior administration. We need to give the government the resources to continue to welcome these children as the law requires, get them to their families, and get them lawyers and child advocates for their immigration cases.
Thank you, Jennifer. You know, the whole public health aspect, that's something that's followed the immigration for a long time, isn't it? I mean, we've seen it on the border, but we've seen this idea of using public health as a way to try to dissuade people that we should do this. And it's always inevitably it's wrong. I wanted to ask you, the law right now, Jennifer, talks about the idea of only holding kids for up to 3 days. Yet I remember when the Dallas Center recently opened, right, for teenage boys, and the convention center, and we heard some people saying, well, it could be as long as 3 months. Now, I have no doubt it's not going to be 3 months for those kids, but talk a little bit about that law, the 72 hours, the 3 days, as opposed to what's happening right now.
So that 72-hour law tracks back to a 2008 law that was a bipartisan bill signed by a Republican president that recognized that kids have special needs And the federal immigration authorities, they're law enforcement. So the idea is children should only be in the custody of law enforcement agents who will interrogate them, who will use their information against them, and who have no incentive or training to treat them as children. Within 72 hours, kids have to be transferred out of that law enforcement environment into the custody of a different federal agency, which is the Department of Health and Human Services. It's the agency that is responsible for healthcare, for funding state child welfare agencies. This is an agency that knows something and has a very different mandate. It should have a very different mandate. I would argue that the prior administration tried to corrupt that mandate by allowing HHS to share children's information with law enforcement, but that 72 hours is intended to get kids out of the Border Patrol law enforcement facilities into the care and custody of HHS officials. The Dallas Center, as well as some of the other temporary facilities that are being opened up, which are being opened up in arguably really inappropriate places, but they're the ones that are available, right? Military bases. My understanding is that all of those will be run by HHS, which means the people inside those facilities will not be law enforcement, and they will not be looking to kick the kids out of the country. Their role, and we'll hold them to it, is to find out who the kids are trying to get to and what their needs are, and to get them there as quickly as possible. So the 72 hours is to get them out of law enforcement Border Patrol facilities to the Department of Health and Human Services, which can take days or weeks, or in some cases months, to reunify kids. And what we're doing is putting pressure on HHS to get kids to their parents and family members as quickly as possible, because as all of you know, the best place for children to be safe, to grow, and to thrive is in a home with family in the community.
Jennifer, let me ask you one more question, and then we'll go on to some of the other panelists. I talked at the beginning about how I remember a couple of times when this has happened, you've had families come forward and say, I'm happy to be a foster parent. I'm happy to help out. But historically, most of these children have sort of a family member. Talk about numbers and your best guess on family members and what's happening with some of these kids.
Historically, the vast majority of unaccompanied kids who arrive at our border have a parent or a close family member in the United States who can step forward and take custody of them. In our conversations over the last few days with folks in the government, and I will just point out the fact that we're having conversations is a complete sea change from the last 4 years. There's actual dialogue taking place between service providers and the government. But they have reported that they think the trends are about the same, that the vast majority of kids who are arriving have family members that they can get to if those family members feel safe stepping forward and know that their information won't be used for law enforcement purposes. So that's a very positive thing. There are always some kids who are fleeing situations of extraordinary violence who don't have anyone here. And there is a need, just as there is a need in the domestic child welfare system for families who can foster, to step forward, to be trained, to be licensed. And the need is not limited to unaccompanied kids. So I think for people who really want to sort of reach out in that way, go to your state child welfare agency, get yourself licensed as a foster family, whether you welcome in kids from the domestic system or migrant children, they're kids in needs of homes. But again, the vast majority of children arriving at our borders do have a family member to go to. They will only stay with that family for the length of their immigration case. But rather than be detained and locked up during their immigration case, they can live safely with family in the community.
And that's always an important point, because so many Americans don't understand that there is a family member already here in most of these cases, right? And it's so much easier to do that reunification quickly when there already is that family member. So, Jennifer Nagda is the policy director at the Young Center for Children's Immigrants' Rights. Jennifer, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Maria Castillo is with us. She's the supervising attorney at the Children's Detained Program with RAICES. Maria is out of San Antonio with the RAICES. Maria, give us a little bit of an idea of your perspective of what you see going on, the reality, the myths, and what's happening with these children.
Right now, one of the biggest things that we're seeing is just that we are seeing these temporary shelters open up, and that is our biggest concern right now, because we service, as the legal providers, we do service several facilities within San Antonio that are more of the permanent welcoming centers for for these children under ORR, the Office of Refugee Resettlement under HHS, as Jennifer had mentioned. And while we do have concerns with some of the treatment there and with certain things, it's still a much better place for them than these temporary shelters. So one of the things that we're seeing is just first that we are seeing a lot of kids at the CBP stations, which as previously mentioned, they're supposed to have 72 hours to process them and transfer them into ORR care. And instead what we're seeing is we're hearing from the kids that it's a lot longer than the 3 days. I've seen it go right now. I've seen it at least about 7 days in these makeshift detention centers within the CBP. So it's much longer, and we're talking about sometimes very young children who have been separated from their adult relative that they came in. So even though we do refer to them as unaccompanied children because they didn't come in with their parent, they don't necessarily come in unaccompanied. So we might have a 10-year-old that came in with their sister or their brother, so not necessarily completely on their own. And what we see is that they're separated upon entering and then put into these very precarious situations in a CBP holding facility for up to, well, at this point, we're not sure, but what we're seeing right now is about at least 7 days that they're being held before being transferred to whatever ORR facility will accept them. So that is the biggest trend that we're seeing right now. As previously mentioned, I feel that it is as a result of the previous administration and the policies that they had in place, where a lot of people last year specifically, they used the pandemic as an excuse to turn kids away. So a lot of kids are just now returning. A lot of them ended up stuck in Mexico in very dangerous situations. So they're just doing what they initiated, which was to come to the United States. So we don't see it as necessarily as the surge, but rather just a response to a difference in policy. And it's not a difference in policy that we haven't seen before, because it's just following the policies that have been in place for decades for these kids and giving them the protections that have been in place for decades. Because we also have, as previously mentioned, the Florida Settlement Agreement, which granted, which is supposed to be that they're only in CBP holding facilities for 72 hours. We have the TVPRA, which also is something else that was signed to protect these children in immigration proceedings as well. And we've seen in the past 3 to 4 years the complete dismantling of a lot of protections, and we're just now getting some of those back, or attempting to establish a more of a normal routine. And it's been, of course, it comes with growing pains because everything was undone. And while we do not support these makeshift facilities that ORR has been opening, there is at this time, because of COVID concerns and because we are seeing all these kids that had previously tried to enter and had been turned away, we are having to make the best of it. And we of course, as legal service providers, one of our main tasks is to provide know your rights presentations for these kids, as well as ask them. We do a legal intake to ask them as well about their treatment at the CBP facility and in the shelters, so that we can address those. If we're seeing a trend of specific violations, we can bring those up to ORR and address them as quickly as possible. But what we're seeing is a lot of movement. Kids are being, because of COVID, several of our shelters here in San Antonio have become somewhat of quarantine shelters, where the kids are coming in for 14 days and immediately transferred elsewhere, and then subsequently released to a relative. So we're seeing a lot of that, which has put a lot of pressure as well on the court system, because rather than DHS waiting to file the documents to put them in court proceedings at their final destination, we're seeing it filed here, which doesn't quite make sense, because then we have to go to court and make sure that the court is transferred and that everything's transferred. But things move so quickly sometimes because of they're being moved around, shuffled around because of COVID, that sometimes we're not sure where the kid is at that moment. So it becomes a challenge for us as well in court. And even the judge that we deal with week to week has been mentioning that, because he's aware of the situation, that there are many kids being held in CBP. He's concerned about what that's going to do for for the court system as well, because it's just so many that it does become very difficult to address all of the cases.
Maria, you talked about this average of 7 days before they move on to, and I know that we actually don't know some of the length of some of the stays for some of these kids. Is that something that we're with pressure like we're trying to do? Is this something that will be able to be shortened as these officials sort of understand it's important to get them to their families?
I hope so. I'm not sure. I know I mentioned 7 days. That's just what I've seen recently because of situations that with kids I've talked to recently. But it could be much longer. It depends on the holding facility that they're in, and it depends how quickly ORR is able to accept them into their care. So the hope right now is to change things and create these more permanent facilities instead of creating additional makeshift facilities that like Air Force bases and things like that, because in order to completely staff these places, you're getting people who are not specifically trained to deal with children, who are not necessarily in it for the right reasons. And if that's when it becomes very unfair to the children, because they are children. And I think that's the main focus, that at the end of the day, these are kids who are coming here for a reason. It's because they're being persecuted in their country. It's because they might not have a parent in their country and they're coming here to reunite with the parent. So at the end of the day, they're children. And we are, by politicizing it, we're making it about other things. So right now, I think the best case scenario is unfortunately these makeshift places, which at least they are in ORR care versus CBP care. But yeah. I mean, that's the hope that it'll eventually change once we address more things, but it's a temporary thing, at least for now.
Maria, let me ask you one more question, then I want to go to Linda and we'll come back, then we'll talk a little bit more. But what is your biggest worry around these children right now, Maria?
I think my biggest worry is that we don't know what to expect. So because there's so many kids being held in CBP custody, we are trying to prepare the best that we can in order to provide these services for them and in order to ensure that they're safe once they arrive. But right now, because of COVID as well, it adds a whole nother layer of concern because we're not there in person. So we see these kids through Zoom and we don't know, a lot of the time we have privacy concerns and they're speaking to an attorney and it's supposed to be confidential, but we're concerned that we might not be hearing everything that they are not able to share with us certain things. And we're concerned about the unknown of how many more kids we can expect, how many more temporary shelters are going to be opening up, and whether we can keep up with just that amount of kids, because it takes a lot of coordination in order to service all the additional shelters, because we do service the permanent ones as well. And it takes a lot of training in order to be able to speak with these kids, because a lot of them, they're coming from very traumatic situations and we don't want to re-traumatize them while we're trying to get their story in order to figure out how to help them. So that's the main concern, is just the unknown at this point.
Maria Castillo is the supervising attorney with the Children's Detained program at RAICES in San Antonio, and you're sticking with us, Maria, I know. Next up, Linda Rivas is with us. She is the executive director of the Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso, Texas. Linda, give us your take on everything you've heard today, but everything you know that's going on the ground, because what you guys are doing is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me here. So it's important to understand that this doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? There's other immigration policies that are still happening that also influence, the unfortunate reality of children having to come to the border by themselves. So we still have this administration, the Biden administration, operating what's called Title 42. And under this policy, as Jennifer mentioned before, this was the same policy that was sending kids back to their home country almost immediately under expulsion. But we still have expulsions going on today with entire families that include very young baby, children, where entire families as a whole are being escorted to the Mexican border, sometimes within hours. This is the reality is it's tragic, it's horrific, it's anxiety inducing, and these parents are put under this enormous amount of pressure where sometimes they're forced to make what is referred to as, it is truly an impossible decision. And they start to think, and we hear them, they reach out to us and they'll even ask us, should I just send my child by themselves, especially now knowing that they will not get returned, which is, it's incredibly obviously traumatic for the child to be separated in that way from their parent. But unfortunately, while we continue to have Title 42 in place, we have a new version of family separation. I will never forget a mother who was returned under, one of the Trump policies, so many cruel policies. She was returned to Mexico, and in the time she was returned, she was actually sexually assaulted in front of her 11-year-old son. The physical manifestations of her injuries and the emotional and psychological ones led her to cry out to us one day that, she may not make it. And she needed to plan something for her son. Ultimately did not send her son over there, thankfully now together and made it into the United States together. But this is still, to me, it really illustrates what these parents are facing. And as a parent, it's difficult. Another situation, in addition to Title 42, which is hard and it plays into it, is we still have grandmas and older siblings, and other family members in these non-traditional, non-nuclear family units that are crossing together. And they are being separated by Border Patrol. And oftentimes that accompanying family member is being expelled to Mexico to really dangerous and desperate situations. And then that child then is designated as unaccompanied, goes into, the CBP processing, like Maria described so well, or eventually to HHS, ORR. But in the meantime, that family member, that companion, that guardian is now going to be on the other side of the border. And sometimes that's also very harmful because as they lose contact, it actually makes reunification with the family member in the United States harder. So those are a couple of things that are happening that I think are important to put into context. Something that I'm seeing, well, a couple of things I want to touch base on is resources. So, my wonderful colleagues touched on this. We have backlogged courts and we're still placing these children in deportation proceedings. And that's creating their own type of backlog when it comes to the care of these children. And I think we should really ask ourselves, and this is the time where this administration can be bold and ask themselves, why are we placing all these resources in putting children into deportation proceedings? There are ways for children to apply for asylum, to apply for, the special juvenile immigrant visa that's available to them, other types of immigration relief without being placed into deportation proceeding. I think that's something we should be looking into and looking into the future. Because the other thing we have here is we have law enforcement. We have such a security lens when we look at this situation. We're looking at it through the lens of security, and you have law enforcement officers that are then playing babysitters, and let's face it, they don't do a very good job. And the reality is we need social workers on the ground with these people. We don't need more Border Patrol agents, just figuring out how to give bottles and feeding. And frankly, again, respectfully, they don't do a good job of it. Having these children in prolonged CBP custody where there are only law enforcement agents around is incredibly problematic, and it's something we really need to look into as well. Unfortunately, I've seen a reality here on the ground of some of the children that are returned with their parents under Title 42. They find themselves in Mexico, a country they definitely did not intend to be in. They have no family ties. They have really absolutely nothing. And these kids are returned shoeless. Why are children being returned shoeless? They're returned hungry. They're returned with extremely soiled diapers. This is the reality here on the ground. And so as we think of children, I think we should think about it as in the entirety of how we are treating children, both unaccompanied and those that are accompanied with their families.
It's interesting. You do see these heartbreaking pictures of, you know, we take in the unaccompanied children, but then these young, very young families that are being sent back. And I know we're being inconsistent across the border on this, but as part of this, when you look at it, Linda, it sort of beckons this whole idea that we need a new immigration system in the United States.
Absolutely. Right now, the only option that people have is to take this incredibly dangerous, often deadly trek into the United States, or on the off chance, just like you mentioned, if one border patrol sector is applying Title 42 differently and allowing some families to stay. I mean, the reality is we have flights coming in from the Rio Grande Valley to El Paso, right? Texas is so big, you all. We're about 12 hours away from each other, just so you know, depending where you are, 9 to 12 hours away. So these families are being flown to El Paso, Texas. You know, at one point we had some families that were going into the arms of our, NGO Shelter Annunciation House, while the other half of the plane was being expelled to Mexico with truly no reason, completely arbitrary. So then you have these families that are taking this calculated risk, and it's incredibly risky, but there's no real other process for them to come to ask for asylum, to enter into the United States, except for this one. And I think that needs to change, and time is of the essence. I think we absolutely need a safe process for people to be able to follow.
Linda, just very briefly, I want to answer this last question, and then we'll go to Yael. You mentioned resources, and all across the border with Texas, and Texas is big, right? I always tell people El Paso is closer to Los Angeles than it is to Houston, right? It's huge. But we see communities, El Paso using their own money to deal with this. We heard from Sister Norma, McAllen is using their own money to do COVID testing. So we see communities along the border that are short on resources anyway. Are you feeling good that the reimbursement is there and that it will come? Or how are you feeling about this idea of resources in our communities?
Yeah, I think it's definitely promising to see the FEMA money coming in and being available to folks. But I also do want to paint the picture that these border communities have been ready to respond with or without resources coming from the federal government for decades now. We are welcoming communities, but this is necessary because it is, again, the only crisis here is how we're choosing to respond. And we need to see those positive changes coming from the federal government. We need to reimagine how we handle migration. And so I think this is a very positive step to work closely with the NGO community, make sure they are supported so that we push away from further, detaining of these children and immigrants and refugees in general. We push away from detaining. We provide hospitality, we welcome with dignity. And I think that the idea that there are going to be resources for our communities is very promising.
All right, thank you, Linda. Linda Rivas is the director at the Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso, Texas. Yael, ¿nos puedes hablar un poco en español? Porque tenemos también personas de la prensa latino que están en este Zoom. ¿Nos puedes hablar un poco de qué está pasando? Y después, si María y Linda tienen algunas palabras en español, también pueden comunicar eso también. Yael?
Por supuesto. And before I go to Spanish, I just want to stress how much I think we all appreciate the push to stop dehumanizing these children, right? And highlighting that any child, right, that goes through this hardship and this journey has a reason to go through this. It is not an easy journey. It is not a quick one. And I'll go then later on the Spanish part, but just I want to stress that to the media.
Thanks,
so
Yael.
Now switching to Spanish, continuamos leyendo sobre una oleada de menores no acompañados en la frontera. Los números ahorita estiman unos 15,000 niños que están entrando y tenemos que poner esta reunión, este panel, queremos enfocarnos en poner una política al lado y centrarnos en los niños. Son niños, no son republicanos, no son demócratas, son niños que necesitan cuidado, que necesitan opciones, que necesitan a sus familias y necesitan básicamente de un cuidado humano y de calidad. Ahora, esto pasa, esto no es nuevo. Para todas las personas que tienen dudas de por qué está pasando, de por qué los números, hay muchas razones y no podemos tomar esto como algo a la ligera y nada más decir es una crisis política. Es una crisis en varios niveles. Tenemos temas como el clima y las estaciones. Cuando el clima se vuelve más caluroso, los números reducen. Tuvimos huracanes, una pandemia que ha afectado la estabilidad económica, la salud emocional y física de las familias. Tenemos, por supuesto, un cambio administrativo que debe nombrarse a políticas más humanas. Hemos tenido 4 años muy duros. Entonces, otra vez, es necesario analizar este tema desde una perspectiva mucho más completa y no desde nada más un tema individual o independiente. Los números sin duda son muy grandes y no estamos viendo soluciones efectivas y rápidas que son esenciales en este momento. Ahora, para entrar también en temas de datos, la mayoría de estos niños tienen un adulto o un guardián ya en Estados Unidos y hoy queremos reforzar que deben reunirse con estos adultos lo más pronto posible. Esto reduce el costo del gobierno en temas económicos, pero también reduce el impacto en la salud mental de los chiquitos que queremos proteger. Como nación creemos en el poder de la familia, así que hay que enfocarnos en eso. Los niños están mejor cuando están con sus familias y eso es lo que tenemos que hacer hoy en día. Tenemos que nombrar las razones por las que están llegando los niños. Otra vez, son niños y debemos asegurar que cuando lleguen aquí estén seguros. Y deben de haber procesos en regla que establezcan pasos para protegerlos del tráfico humano, de carteles, de pobreza, de violencia doméstica. Otra vez, si están pasando por esta jornada es porque de verdad lo necesitan y deben sentirse seguros cuando lleguen. Es muy importante otra vez que agilicemos este proceso y que nos aseguremos de reunirlos con sus familiares o guardianes lo más pronto posible. La hermana Norma Pimentel nos comparte, por ejemplo, que Caridades Católicas, además de recibir a estos niños, ha puesto un sistema para establecer o para hacer pruebas de COVID tan pronto se bajan del camión los niños, para asegurarse que entran al refugio libres de COVID y así los mantienen a ellos y protegen también a los demás niños seguros y saludables. Nagda, la directora de políticas del Centro Young para Niños Migrantes, nos dice que esta no es una nueva crisis, que este es el resultado de décadas de crisis y más que nada el resultado y una respuesta en los últimos 4 años en donde las familias fueron separadas, los niños fueron lastimados y hubo mucho daño e impacto en estos chiquitos. La mayoría de los niños que vemos en las noticias son muchos niños, como nos recalca Jennifer, que habían sido afectados, separados, lastimados por las acciones o por la respuesta del gobierno los últimos 4 años. Y si analizamos el resto de los números, entonces también podemos ver la respuesta a estas migraciones. El enfoque más que en los números, entonces nos dice Jennifer, debe ser en cómo respondemos como nación y cómo atendemos a estos niños. A los medios en específico, Jennifer les pide dejar de nombrar esto como una oleada y explica que esto deshumaniza a los niños y los motivos por los que están migrando. Entonces hace una solicitud muy clara en nombrar los niños menores no acompañados. Y recalca que no es una crisis del presidente Biden, el gobierno está implementando lo que la ley señala como respuesta a estos niños y establece que no debemos tener a estos niños en centros por más de 3 días. Una ley que se estableció por ambos partidos en el 2008. Los niños pueden estar en custodia por un máximo de 3 días, pero sabemos que estas custodias no están preparadas para cuidar a los niños. Entonces, después de estos niños se deben reunir con sus familias o poner a cargo del Departamento de Salud y Servicios Humanos. Esto es con personal preparado para proteger el bienestar de los niños. María Castillo, la abogada de RAICES, destaca que debemos seguir abogando porque los niños no se queden más de 3 días en las estaciones de aduanas y de protección fronteriza. Recalca que aunque los denominamos niños no acompañados, muchos de ellos en realidad llegan con, por ejemplo, hermanos, no llegan solos. Pero lo que estamos viendo en estas estaciones es otra vez un trato no humano que además de tener este trato no aceptable, los separan de sus hermanos, de sus amigos y no son tratados como niños que necesitan protección y cuidado. María nos dice que una de las mayores preocupaciones que tienen los representantes legales es la incertidumbre, ¿no? De no saber si están escuchando la realidad de los niños, toda la información clara, si la información está siendo controlada dentro de estos centros. Y finalmente, Linda Rivas, la directora ejecutiva del Centro de Defensa de Migrantes de las Américas, refuerza lo que comenta María y comenta cómo en respuesta a las políticas, por ejemplo, las expulsiones bajo el título 42, los padres están teniendo que tomar decisiones imposibles. Y creo que todos los que somos padres de familia aquí lo entendemos. en donde, por ejemplo, si como familia van a llegar a los Estados Unidos pidiendo asilo y van a ser expulsados, entonces la opción de mandar a sus hijos solos es la única forma de salvarlos. Linda nos dice que esta administración tiene una oportunidad muy grande de cambiar la ruta legal de estos niños, en lugar de continuar colocándolos en procedimientos de deportación, por ejemplo, lo que solo continúa retrasando los procesos y alarga el tiempo de estos niños en centros no aptos para ellos. Y para finalizar, recalcar todos que el tiempo y la toma de decisiones y acciones rápidas es esencial en este momento.
Thank you, Yael. Maria, we're running low on time. In 1 minute, in English or Spanish, what would you add? And I'll ask Linda for 1 minute as well.
Ok, lo voy a hacer en español. Como dijo, ya los niños vienen aquí por muchas razones, pero lo importante es que vienen a mejorar su futuro, vienen por razones muy importantes y merecen nuestro apoyo porque al fin del día son niños, siguen siendo niños y los debemos de tratar como niños con humanidad y no hacerlo algo que motive una crisis o algo que motive algo que no es, porque al fin del día son niños y han tenido esas protecciones por muchísimos años y eso es lo que merecen, ser tratados como seres humanos, más que nada.
Thank you, Maria. Linda, en español o inglés, en 1 minuto, algo that you would add?
Sí, claro. Bueno, quiero recalcar en español que es hora de terminar el título 42. Las expulsiones bajo el título 42 son muy crueles y sí impactan a niños, aunque estos niños no estén acompañados de sus papás. Es algo muy traumático y tenemos que empezar a tener una visión y reimaginar un sistema migratorio que se trata a las personas con dignidad y humanidad y empujar en contra de más seguridad, más seguridad nacional y ver esta situación de un lado humanitario. Ya es hora, esperemos que esta administración esté lista para tomar esos pasos.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you, Maria. I'll end with the focus here is these are children. We need to treat them as children and take care of them, reunite them as quickly as possible with their families. Let their families take the onus on of making sure they get to court and that they're processed. Get them to their families as soon as possible. That needs to be the overwhelming goal here for these kids. We don't want them traumatized further by bureaucracy. We don't want them to be held in institutions or institutionalized. We want them with their families or their guardians. That is the key thing here. We love that there's this new humanitarian outlook, but we want to make sure that we go as far towards humanitarianism as possible when treating these children. It's so, so important. I want to thank everyone here. Yael, the director of the Center for New American Children, Maria Castillo with RAICES, Linda Rivas with Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center in El Paso. Thank you all very much for all the work. And of course, we want to thank Jennifer, Nagda, and Sister Norma for being with us today. Thank you guys very much for all that you do. We continue to work on behalf of children. Thank you all so much.